Vanity Fair first pointed this out last summer with this blunt headline, quote, "Exclusive. Is Donald Trump's endgame the launch of Trump News?" Trump TV found a home on Donald Trump's Facebook page during the campaign. It never really broadened beyond that page, and when Trump actually won the election, Trump TV kind of fizzled out. But now, Trump TV is back in more ways than one. For one, the Facebook videos are back. They're being paid for by Trump's re-election campaign and filmed at Trump Tower. They're being produced to look like short news updates that are anchored by presidential daughter-in-law Lara Trump, wife of Eric, who insists that she's giving you the, quote, real news.
Hey everybody, Lara Trump here. I bet you haven't heard about all the accomplishments the president had this week because there's so much fake news out there. We wanted to give you a glimpse into his week.
That's the real news. And now Sinclair's about to expand its reach even further through a new deal that they're pursuing, which once it goes through, will allow Sinclair stations to reach 72% of all U.S. households nationwide. That's beyond the reach that the FCC typically allows. But luckily for Sinclair, they've got a friend in the government, specifically the FCC. Ajit Pai, the man handpicked by Donald Trump to be the FCC chairman. You may know Mr. Pai as the person who was trying to kill net neutrality. Well, he's also the guy bending the rules that will ensure Sinclair can reach 3/4 of the country with their pro-Trump bottom line with Boris messaging.
The bottom line is this. General Kelly will bring more organization and precision to the White House. Having said that, he is not coming in to revamp the Trump presidency, but to unleash the full potential of it.
That was former Trump campaign senior advisor Boris Epshteyn, who now has a job as chief political analyst at a powerful media entity that has largely flown under the radar. Sinclair Broadcast Group is the nation's largest TV broadcaster and owns more than 170 local TV stations around the country. If you live in, say, Scranton, Pennsylvania or Syracuse, New York, 3 of your local stations are owned by Sinclair, and they take a pretty hands-on approach. Boris Epshteyn's segments, with their decidedly pro-Trump administration spin, are designated as must-run when they're distributed to all those 170 stations, meaning those stations must include them in their local news broadcasts. And they are. Sinclair also makes its stations run scaremongering terrorism alert desk segments, which often feature stories of questionable news value. During the presidential campaign, it sent its stations a package that suggested in part that voters should not support Hillary Clinton because the Democratic Party was historically pro-slavery. Sinclair also sends out packages on the news of the day, often with a pro-Trump spin, for local news anchors to read word for word, as noted on a recent edition of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver.
Did the FBI have a personal vendetta in pursuing the Russia investigation of President Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn?
Did the FBI have a personal vendetta in pursuing the Russia investigation of President Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn?
Did the FBI have a personal vendetta
in pursuing the Russia investigation of
President Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn?
Sinclair's Vice President of News, Scott Livingston, casts its coverage as a corrective to mainstream media bias.
I'm sure you know about the troubling trend of irresponsible and one-sided news stories plaguing our country. The sharing of bias and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, national media outlets are publishing these fake news stories without fact-checking. Unfortunately, some members of the national media are using their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Now, it would be one thing if Sinclair was upfront about its own personal agenda and bias, but most viewers don't know whether Sinclair owns their local station or if their local anchors are being forced to read what amounts to pro-Trump propaganda between the sports and the weather. Now, the Trump administration is poised to reward Sinclair by changing FCC regulations to allow the company to own more stations.
I've got a message for certain students. Listen up closely, Snowflake. Yes, I'm talking to you. You, the social justice warrior who whines for trigger warnings and safe spaces. College isn't a babysitting service. It's time to grow up, Snowflake.
Okay, that's a taste of what you might have seen on your local news, at least if your local news station is owned by Sinclair Broadcasting, a relatively obscure media behemoth that, unbeknownst to most of its viewers, insists its stations run these right-leaning commentaries and news packages. Joining me now, MSNBC media analyst Gabe Sherman, special correspondent for Vanity Fair. So I want to start with just how people know whether they're watching a Sinclair station, which is that, I mean, how do they know?
The truth is they don't. I mean, Sinclair owns affiliates all over the country that are affiliated with the big networks. And so if you're watching your local ABC, NBC, or Fox affiliate in a market, you may have no idea that the corporate owner of this network has a political point of view. Sinclair does not brand its networks. We are, like Fox News would say, we are a conservative network, where Fox News, the viewers would know that. Sinclair does not market itself as the owner of these networks.
Yeah, and there's also the difference between local affiliates. I mean, when I grew up in New York, I would think of the network as the association, right? But outside of the major markets, like, you could be watching ABC in one market that's Sinclair owned and NBC in another, or CBS in another, and they're just owned by Sinclair. That those numbers, those letters don't really mean anything in terms of the news program.
Of course, and that's, you know, that is really why this is such a sea change possibly in the American media landscape, where you have a ideologically predisposed company that could push its message behind the curtain of objective news. I mean, this also we should just put in the context of a generational quest by Republicans to change the media landscape in their favor, going back to 1987 when Ronald Reagan's FCC repealed the Fairness Doctrine, which allows one point of view, which gave rise to talk radio. We are now seeing the rise potentially of right-wing broadcasting in television.
Sort of a talk radioization of local news.
Exactly.
And how, I mean, how controversial is the approval of the deal itself?
Well, you talk to people in the media industry, whether or not they're ideologically aligned with Sinclair, and they say this is very controversial. And in fact, Rupert Murdoch has now made overtures for Fox to acquire more local stations because they don't want a corporate competitor like Sinclair to be competing with them. You know, there used to be laws in place that prevented the corporate overlords to buy up all the local markets because you did not want to have a homogenous point of view. And now that these regulations are being repealed, there's nothing to say that NBC or Comcast could go and buy up local stations. You know, anyone who is on the position of being against crony capitalism, they should not, you know, reward this behavior.
Joining us now is Ramesh Srinivasan, and he's a professor of information studies at UCLA and author of the book, Whose Global Village? Rethinking How Technology Shapes Our World. Hope I didn't mangle your name too badly.
You actually nailed it.
I got it. All right. Yes. So let's talk about this Sinclair deal, because I think to the ordinary person, you're thinking, wait a minute, how can one company reach 72% of the country with essentially propaganda?
Right. So this is actually nothing less than a massive assault on our democracy and on our media institutions. What we're talking about here is the takeover of local television stations by a conglomerate. Previously, Sinclair was only allowed, like any other media company, only allowed to access 39% of American households. And if you saw the distinction between the two maps that you showed, you can see that now this media group has taken over local TV stations. So this is not national TV stations that some people have skepticism around. This isn't Breitbart. This isn't, you know, sort of a right-wing, even Fox News channel. This is your local channel. So the people in this country have some sort of sense of division, and they have a sense of distrust of institutions right now. But one thing people tend to trust are, you know, the mom and pop places, the local TV stations. But what happens when those are actually taken over by a conglomerate that we know is planting, directly forcing stories onto local TV networks? So this is a media strategy, and this is fundamentally anti-democratic.
And Sinclair has a history, right? I mean, this isn't the first time. Bottom line with Boris isn't their first foray into sort of tilted news.
Exactly. And you see these various sorts of shadow media figures that are behind the Trump rise, right? I mean, we've, of course, talked about Steve Bannon. I've spoken on MSNBC before about Cambridge Analytica and Robert Mercer and the data kind of wars. And this is another figure, Mr. Smith, the CEO of Sinclair. And we see examples of how Sinclair has actually essentially used Epstein to show up on various channels to dispute and change narratives around various sorts of more factually forms of reporting that are actually critiquing what Trump is doing. For example, around the Flynn story.
Right. And has there been any pushback from the stations themselves and employees there?
It's really hard to do, right? I mean, these stations tend to not have a lot in terms of financial sustainability. They're being bought out out by conglomerates. And this is the issue. In a divided America, this is the key point for me. In a divided America, what does Trump need to survive? Trump has not been successful at almost anything. I can't say for his life, but in his public life, he's not been a great businessman. Apparently, he's not a great golfer either. But what he has been successful for was the ratings that he got as a media, showman, right? So if he's the showman on a media empire that's taking over not just, Facebook and so on, but also your local TV stations, there is a powerful possibility to maintain that base because we see that base eroding. And this is a very intelligent media strategy that I think people need to pay attention to. I'm really glad you're reporting this.
Yeah, it's scary stuff. Ramesh Srinivasan, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you. All right.